All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to take a look at Stanisław Leśniewski.
Okay.
So, who is Stanisław Leśniewski? Well, he was one of the main founders of what's called the Warsaw School of Logic.
Okay.
And he was, he's known for being really, really original when it comes to the foundations of mathematics.
Yeah.
So, for our listeners, who really like philosophy and the philosophy of knowledge and reality and all that, his way of doing things, it's really different. It's unorthodox.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be really interesting to kind of delve into it.
I think so too. And I think one of the reasons why it'll be so interesting to kind of look into his work is because, he was working in this really, really exciting intellectual climate. And he developed a foundational system that was very, very different from any other.
Right.
So it was based on three formal systems that he came up with.
Okay.
So there was a protothetic, which was his logic of propositions.
Okay.
And then there was ontology,
Yeah.
which was his logic of names.
Okay.
And then there was Mariology,
Okay.
which was his theory of part and whole.
Okay.
And I think that for someone who's interested in philosophy, one of the most striking things about Leśniewski is this unwavering commitment to being rigorous.
Yeah.
And he pairs that with nominalism.
Right.
And so this combination is, pretty unique, and it led him to some pretty revolutionary conclusions about the nature of logic and mathematics.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning. I mean, who was this guy? Where did he come from? What was his background?
Right.
I mean, he was born in 1886. I know that.
Right.
And he was educated in philosophy and math, across Europe.
Yeah.
And he got his doctorate under Kazimierz Twardowski.
Right.
And wow.
That's right in the law.
And I guess it's important to recognize that he was working within this strong Polish tradition, right?
Right. Yeah. Twardowski himself, he was a student of Brentano.
Oh, okay.
And he was a very, very important person in Polish philosophy.
Okay.
And his emphasis on really analyzing concepts precisely, really in detail, probably shaped Leśniewski's rigorous approach.
Okay.
But there's a kind of a twist here.
Oh, okay.
So during the Polish Bolshevik War,
Right.
Leśniewski served as a code breaker
Oh, wow.
for the Polish general staff.
So he was putting this logical thinking to real use.
Yeah, exactly.
In a very high stakes situation.
Yeah, very much so.
Wow, that's incredible.
Also, you have these abstract philosophical inquiries on the one hand, and then, really concrete problems on the other.
Right. Very interesting.
Yeah. So then after the war, he got a professorship
Right.
at the University of Warsaw, and they created this position specifically for him.
Okay.
And this is where the story becomes even more interesting for people who are interested in the history of logic.
Right.
Because at the University of Warsaw, he worked with Jan Łukasiewicz,
Right.
who's another really big name.
Big name in logic. Yeah.
Yep. And then Alfred Tarski was his only doctoral student.
Right.
And these three guys together, they kind of formed this center of mathematical logic that was
Yeah.
like the best place in the world at the time.
In the interwar period.
Yeah. So you can imagine like all the intellectual exchange that was happening.
That must have been quite a place to be.
Oh yeah. Definitely.
So clearly, Leśniewski was right in the middle of all this.
Right.
And now I think we need to look at his work.
Okay.
So he started out working on the philosophy of logic and language.
Yeah.
And he was interested in ideas like truth, denotation, and the fundamental laws of logic.
Right.
And he was looking at thinkers like Mill,
Yeah.
Marty,
Yep.
and Husserl.
That's right.
But then he kind of went back on all these early writings of his.
Right. Yeah. He repudiated them.
She repudiated them. That's a pretty strong move for a philosopher, I would think,
It is a strong move.
to
Yeah.
just reject all that work.
It is. But for a philosopher who is, interested in the way that someone's thought developed over time, I think it's really important to see that even in those early writings, even in the ones that he rejected later, you can still see the seeds of his mature work.
Right.
So you can see that he was always committed to this logical precision.
Right.
And he was very careful to distinguish between how we use language and how we talk about language.
Right.
So the use mention distinction,
Right.
he was very careful about that.
Okay.
And that became really important for him later on.
Right. And he was also looking very carefully at what his contemporaries were doing.
Right.
So he was looking at Brentano's views on existential propositions.
Right.
And he was also, looking at Uke Savadich's analyses of the principles of contradiction.
Right.
And excluded middle.
Right.
And that leads us to kind of this key moment, I think.
Yeah.
In his development as a logician.
Okay.
Because he started to think really hard about Ukasijevich's work on the principle of contradiction.
Okay.
And this is what led him to, actually try to deal with Russell's antinomy.
Okay.
Head on.
Okay.
So this is so basically he read Ukasijevich's 1910 work,
Right.
which talked about Russell's paradox.
Okay.
And it really had a big impact on him.
Okay.
And at first he thought, oh, this is easy. I can solve this, right away.
Right.
In fact, he was so engrossed in trying to solve this problem, he missed his train.
But that was kind of the start
Yeah.
of this lifelong project for him.
Right.
To try to create a logical foundation for mathematics that wouldn't fall apart because of paradoxes like this.
Right.
And he was really critical of what he saw as a lack of rigor in Principia Mathematica.
Right.
And he also didn't like the way that standard set theory relied on these abstract entities.
Okay.
So this became his main goal, to create this new system.
Okay.
And it's really where he starts to differ from everyone else.
Mhm.
And that's what I think is it's so interesting for a philosopher.
Right.
Especially someone who's thinking about how we ground our knowledge.
Right.
What are the foundations of what we know?
Right. Yeah.
So he had some pretty unusual views
Right.
Early on
Right.
about existential propositions.
Right.
So for example, he thought that they were all analytic.
Okay. Well, for a philosopher, I mean, existence is like this really basic, contingent thing, in reality.
Right, exactly.
So that sounds really counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does sound counterintuitive.
Can you help me understand how he arrived at that?
Sure. So so he was following Mill.
Yeah.
And he was making this distinction between denotation and connotation.
Right.
So denotation is what a term refers to.
Okay.
And connotation is, the properties that it signifies.
Okay.
So then he defined an analytic proposition as a positive subject-predicate statement where the predicate doesn't say anything new about the subject.
Okay.
So then this is the key step, right? He said that exist doesn't have a connotation,
Okay.
unlike Mill, who thought that it did.
Okay.
So he thought that exist doesn't say anything about properties.
Okay.
So if you use it as a predicate, you're not adding any new information.
Okay.
So a statement like people exist, he would say that's analytic
Okay.
because you're not saying anything new about people. You're
Right.
just saying that they exist.
Right.
So I guess the main point here is that he's trying to be really precise
Right.
about what existence is.
Okay.
He's trying to, separate it from the idea of property.
Okay. Okay. So, I can see how he's building this logical system,
Right.
but it seems really far from how we usually talk about existence.
Right.
Like how do we square those two things?
Right. Yeah. So he thought that a lot of the ways that we talk about things are okay. Like they can be true or false,
Okay.
but they're not the best way to get at what's really going on
Okay.
logically.
Okay.
So for example, if you want to say, people exist,
Right.
but you want to say it in a way that's synthetic
Yeah.
and contingent,
Right.
then you should say some beings are people. Or if you want to say a square circle does not exist,
Right.
but you want to say it in a way that's synthetic,
Okay.
and you should say no being is a square circle.
Okay.
And he made this table where he contrasted the bad way of saying things
Right.
with the good way of saying things.
Okay.
And so he was trying to make the way that we talk match up with the logic
Okay.
of what we're saying.
Okay. So he was basically trying to make language more rigorous,
Right, exactly.
more philosophically informed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned before that he criticized Łukasiewicz.
Yeah.
And their first meeting sounds rather interesting.
Yeah, it was pretty intense.
He just showed up and was like, "Hey, I have all these proofs against you."
Yeah. Yeah, he basically did. He came in with proofs of an article I have written against you.
Wow.
So in his 1912 paper, he challenged Łukasiewicz's idea that no A is B was the same as saying if something is A, then it is not B.
Okay.
So he was saying that no object can be both B and not B.
Right.
That's necessarily true. That's the ontological principle of contradiction.
Right.
But he didn't think that was the same
Right.
as that logical equivalence.
Okay.
And Łukasiewicz himself, he actually wrote about this meeting later.
Wow.
And he said that he was so impressed by Leśniewski's arguments
Wow.
that he almost gave up on logic.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so it just shows you how seriously they were taking this.
Yeah.
And how high the standards were
Yeah.
in this new Warsaw School of Logic.
Right. Okay. So he
Right.
he wasn't afraid to challenge the accepted wisdom of logic.
Right, that's right.
And he didn't stop there, did he? Yeah. I mean, he went on to question the principle of excluded middle, right?
Yeah, he did in his 1913 critique of the logical principle of excluded middle.
Okay.
So he was very careful to separate the ontological principle,
Yeah.
which is that every object has to have a property or not have it,
Right.
from the logical principle,
Okay.
which is that for any two contradictory propositions, one of them has to be true.
Right.
And he was rejecting the logical principle,
Okay.
especially when you're talking about things that don't exist.
Okay.
So every centaur has a tail,
Yeah.
and some centaur does not have a tail.
Right. Okay.
He said those are both false
Okay.
because there are no centaurs.
Right.
So the key point here
Okay.
is that he was a nominalist,
Right.
and he thought the logic should be about things that actually exist.
Right. Okay. So he wasn't going to entertain, hypothetical, entities.
Right.
Okay. Okay. And this idea, kind of led him to challenge Twardowski's theory of general objects.
Exactly.
And the general horse example, I think, is a great way of understanding, his argument.
Yeah. That's a really good example.
So the general horse, it's neither black nor not black,
Right.
which kind of shows that there's a problem there.
Yeah. So his argument was that if you have a general horse, then it has to have all the properties that all horses have.
Right.
But some horses are black and some horses are not black.
Right.
So the general horse can't be black.
Right.
And it can't be not black.
Right.
And that's a contradiction.
Right.
So that means that there can't be such a thing as a general horse.
Okay. And this is kind of a violation of excluded middle, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a different way of violating excluded middle.
Okay. So he was very consistent in his philosophy.
Right.
He wasn't going to have any of these abstract entities.
Yeah.
And he also went on to discuss the question of timeless bivalence with Kotarbiski.
Right.
And he had his own take on Russell's paradox.
Right, exactly. So in 1913, he was debating with Kotarbiski
Okay.
about whether truth was timeless or not.
Right.
And he argued that it was.
Okay.
And his arguments actually convinced Kotarbiski to change his mind.
Wow.
So those early discussions about future contingent propositions, they happened before Łukasiewicz's many-valued logic.
Okay.
And then in 1914, he came up with this really original analysis of Russell's paradox.
Okay.
And he said that classes should be understood as mereological sums.
Okay.
So he was saying that the class of all A's shouldn't be thought of as this abstract set,
Okay.
but it should be thought of as the mereological sum of all the individual A's.
Okay.
And in his mereology, every object is considered a part of itself.
Okay.
So no class can fail to be a part of itself.
Right.
And he thought that this actually was in line with how Cantor understood classes at first.
Okay.
So he saw his approach as more grounded
Right.
than set theory.
Okay. So by the time he gets to Moscow, during WWI,
Right.
he's already working on this alternative system,
Right. Yeah.
which would become Mariology.
Right.
And it's interesting that he didn't like symbols,
Right.
at first
Yeah. He was suspicious of them.
because of Principia Mathematica, right?
Yeah. Because he thought that Principia Mathematica had some problems.
Right.
And so in his 1916 work,
Right.
Foundations of a General Theory of Sets I,
Okay.
he was basically presenting his theory of part-whole relations.
Okay.
And he didn't use the term Mariology yet.
Right.
He used the term Nogashit, which means plurality or set.
Okay.
But he was already thinking about how to deal with collections of things
Okay.
without using abstract sets.
Right.
And he didn't use a lot of symbols.
Right.
He was using natural language
Right.
because he wanted to be really clear.
Right.
And he didn't want to run into the same problems that he thought Whitehead and Russell had run into,
Right.
where they were confusing how they were using language with what they were talking about.
Right.
So it wasn't until later that he came across Frege's work,
Okay.
and he really liked Frege's system.
Okay.
He thought that it was much more logically precise
Okay.
and much clearer.
Okay.
So that's when he started to really appreciate symbolic logic.
Okay. So he wasn't completely against it.
Right.
It's just that he had to see it done right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So I think it's important to point out that he developed these three systems.
Right.
Mariology, ontology, and protothetic in that order.
Right.
Um, but that's not actually the logical order, right?
That's right. Yeah,
Right.
it's the reverse.
Okay, so what does that tell us?
Well, I think it tells us that he really believed that logical systems should be meaningful from the start.
Okay.
They shouldn't just be formal games
Right.
that we have to then interpret.
Yeah.
And so when he finally did adopt symbolic notation in 1920, he was persuaded by Leon Twistek to do that.
Okay.
He had already worked out a lot of the basic ideas
Okay.
in a more axiomatic form.
Okay.
So for him, the symbols were always standing in for something that he already understood.
Okay.
They weren't just meaningless marks on paper.
Right.
So this is very different from formalism,
Right.
where you just have these symbols that you manipulate according to rules,
Right.
and then you have to figure out what they mean later.
Yeah.
So he wasn't interested in that.
Okay, so let's look at these systems in a bit more detail.
Okay.
Starting with Mariology. So this early Mariology from 1916, what were the main ideas that a philosopher might be interested in?
Okay, so the early Mariology was based on this idea of part.
Okay.
And he had 4 axioms and 3 definitions.
Okay.
So axioms I and II, they said how parts work, the basic things about parts.
Okay.
So axiom I says that if A is a part of B, then B can't be a part of A.
Right.
That's asymmetry.
Right.
And then axiom Sasegerpen says that if A is part of B and B is part of C, then A has to be part of C.
Right.
That's transitivity.
Okay.
And then definition I introduced this idea of an ingredient,
Okay.
which is basically an object in all its parts.
Okay.
And then definition 2 defined a set as a concrete object where every part of it overlaps with some member of the set.
Okay.
And that member is also part of the original object. So
Okay.
it's kind of like a Mariological sum.
Okay.
And then definition 3 defined a class as a set that includes all the individuals of a certain kind. And then axioms the third and foreign said that these classes exist and there's only one of each.
Okay.
So the point here is that he's trying to do something similar to set theory,
Okay.
but he's doing it in a very different way.
Right.
He's not using abstract sets. He's just using this idea of part,
Okay.
which is something that we can understand,
Right.
intuitively.
Oh, okay.
So even in this early system, he's dealing with collections,
Right.
but he's not doing it in the standard way.
Okay.
And he even defined element
Right.
in this Mariological framework.
Okay. So how did he define element?
So he said that an element of an object is any object that's one of the individuals that the object is made up of.
Okay.
So if you have an object A and it's made up of individuals X, Y, and Z, then X is an element of A.
Okay.
And Y is an element of A, and Z is an element of A.
Okay.
And he proved that the ingredients of an object and the elements of an object are actually the same thing in this early system.
Okay.
And as you said, he was using these phrases like for some meaning of the expression X,
Right.
to express quantification.
Right.
And that's because he was still being careful about symbolic notation.
Right.
He was really focused on the meaning of the expressions.
Okay.
But later on, he wasn't happy with this way of doing things.
Right.
He thought that it was a bit messy
Okay.
to have axioms and definitions all mixed up together.
Yeah.
So he wanted to have a system where the axioms were only about parts.
Okay. Okay. So he's going for this logical purity.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. So let's move on to ontology,
Okay.
which is his logic of names.
Yeah.
And he called it ontology because it's about the word is.
Right. Yeah, he was interested in all the different ways that we use is.
Okay.
And he wanted to create a system that captured that.
Okay. So what was his goal with ontology?
So after he did Mariology, he realized that he was using a lot of logic that I hadn't really explained.
Right.
So he wanted to go back and fill in those gaps.
Okay.
So he wanted to formalize the logic of names
Right.
and expressions that involve names.
Okay.
And he was looking at, traditional logic,
Right.
like Aristotle's syllogisms
Yeah.
and Schroeder's algebra of logic.
Okay.
But he always wanted to ground his system in how we actually use language.
Yeah.
So he started by collecting propositions that he thought were obviously true.
Right.
Like if A is B, then A is A.
Right.
And things like that.
Okay.
And then he started to build from there.
Okay.
And so he focused on this form, the singular proposition form.
Okay.
A is AB.
Right.
Which he wrote as A.